In this section, we're going to talk about the prototype and the build validations, two critical components that are part of the lean process of building products. This section goes into detail about prototype and build validations. The product leaders use prototype validation to test the earlier product ideas using low-cost tools. The activities span the customer and development sphere. First, the prototype validation may overlap with idea validation when the product leader uses basic prototypes to improve the conversation about earlier ideas. Some of the prototyping involves the skills of UX designers. Product leaders place a prototype request in the UX backlog and then work with designers to clarify needs and test stories back with the customer. Prototype validation requires more resources than earlier customer conversations, but still takes less than building the product out. Prototypes range from a crude drawing on the back of a napkin to fully functional A/B testing web pages. To minimize cost, use simple and quick wireframes early and proceed to the more detailed and functional prototypes after they pass these less expensive tests. There are many tools available now for easy online prototyping. One company, Balsamiq, allows you to take a digital image and make specific areas act as buttons and input. Within minutes, you can have an active online prototype for demos and usability testing. To help with A/B testing, Zara is another online testing tool that gives you heat maps and timing as the users move their mouse and input data. So this is an example of a start screen that sets up the next screens to capture user data. In version A, users enter their data directly into text boxes. After they click on Get Quote, the timing stops. In version B, enter their zip code into a text box and everything else is dropped down. So after multiple users go through this test, you not only know the quality of the data by looking at the text input, but the tools gives you an average time that it took for A versus B. The same tool also gives you heat maps that can be used on simple prototypes, as well as complicated screens that are already in production. This shows where an aggregate of users spent their time on a page, and it's immediately apparent where the hottest locations that users are concentrating are. So a Concierge Prototype is a manually created high-fidelity solution that simulates and substitutes for an automated product. So as an example, user submits the information, the system returns automatically the results will be emailed to you shortly. And then humans on the back end manually research a request and then email the results. This human-powered solution has simulated an automatic product, although the results may be slower. This hands-on approach tests the different inputs and works out the kinks in the process required to deliver results before an expensive build. Pirate metrics obviously get their name from the R acronym that describes the 5 stages needed to capture a customer. Acquisition, how do users find you? Activation, how do you stay interested? Retention, do they come back? Revenue, are you making money? And referral, are users telling their friends? So first, Pirate metrics give designers a framework to plan the website to convert and funnel web users into customers. And second, it defines metric stages that help to measure the fallout along the path to customer capture. Website A/B prototyping provides this objective data to provide the capture rate at each stage. 3D printing is growing and becoming more sophisticated every day. As it matures, it will revolutionize how physical products are made by moving much of the physical work that needs to be done now into software. Early prototyping will be faster and cheaper, lowering costs and accelerating products to market. Production costs on small quantities will plummet for products that can be created on 3D printers, allowing for more customization and faster iteration of the product. If a prototype validates with a customer, the last step in the prototype validation is to have the product leader push it into the build backlog. So the timing on this, the prototype validation schedule matches the time box sprint cycle, and it typically precedes the build cycle by a few weeks, just enough time to have it stable before it builds, but not too much time for the validation to get stale. The build validation is the last of 3 validations and uses working functionality to evaluate for customer value. The product leader has 2 different jobs, one before the product build and one after. So before the build, they first communicate the broad stories in the backlog to the team. Next, they decompose the broad stories into detailed user stories with the team. And third, they assist the team with the estimation and sizing for the sprint queue. And then after the build, product leaders take the completed functionality back to the customer. And then last, they bring the customer feedback to the team and into the backlog. Now, the timing on this, in the first part of the build workflow before the build, the velocity matches the time box sprint cycle. And in the second part, where the product leader takes the working functionality to the customer and then returns their feedback, this can be delayed by weeks depending on the customer's schedule and the metrics they gather in order to measure the value. So here's a summary of the 3 validations. First, the idea validation workflow. Customer conversations, competitive analysis. They develop the stories and then populate the product solutions database. And the timing on this is first the continuous validation prototype validation workflow, and then there are progressively more detailed prototypes that build on each other. And second, they populates the UX backlog. And then for timing, UX backlogs are filled at the same rate as it's consumed, and it always precedes the build cycle by some weeks. And last, the build validation. First, the product leader communicates the stories to the development team. They help with the story estimates. They take a build back to the customer, and then they bring the validation back to the team from the customer. Now for build timing, before the product build, the validation velocity matches the sprint cycle, and after the build, feedback is typically delayed by a few weeks while waiting for customer conversations. Since the yardstick for product progress is customer value, and we can't measure customer value until it's released, speed of the releases affects the speed of the product. How can we get this going faster? So one option is to continuous deployment, or also called continuous integration. Developers must always make trade-offs between speed and quality when they release their code. So when they crank out code quickly, they're heroes, at least until they cause an issue with the product. With continuous integration, they release small chunks of functionality, maybe only 1% of an actual feature, into a test environment. Since this is more production safe, they're biased more towards the speed and more likely to release than delay. If it fails in test, developers take this learning, fix the code, and quickly re-release. Since it's a small amount of code and functionality, it can be quickly tested. After successful testing, it moves over into production. When there's enough functionality for customer validation, it can be tested to a limited audience. So based on customer feedback, the code is then either pulled or released to all customers. Continuous deployment takes the usual Scrum timing and revs it up a notch. This table compares non-continuous Scrum cycles with continuous integration examples. So number 1, lines of code. Hundreds in Scrum versus 25 or so in CI, continuous integration. And second, the release schedule is weeks versus hours. And third, the connection between the release and functionality, loosely connected in Scrum and completely disconnected in CI. Continuous integration releases are only a very small part of a working feature. These are examples of 4-release hierarchy. So first, most releases within a continuous deployment do not have apparent customer value on their own. There are many releases needed to complete a user story. There are typically multiple user stories released before it's considered a user feature. This could be equated to a user epic. And multiple feature releases are grouped together for marketing or version releases. So how do I start using this? As you break down your product into smaller pieces, create surveys, low-cost wireframes, and our Concierge Prototyping to test before you ask development to build. If you have access to user designers, ask for the help. Otherwise, you need to do it yourself. For B2C products, start collecting a shortened list of pirate metrics.